Autumn of 1103 CE. Somewhere deep in the Þjórsárdalur Valley, a mountain had been asleep for 250 years. Nobody in the valley knew that. Nobody in any valley knew that. The people who farmed this land had never heard the mountain make a sound. Their grandparents had farmed here, their grandparents' grandparents. The soil was dark and heavy, almost impossibly fertile. The kind of soil that made this particular fold in southern Iceland one of the most prosperous farming districts in the entire country. 20 farms, roughly 400 to 600 people. Cattle, sheep, children, smoke rising from turf roofs all the way up the valley toward the highlands, where the glacier sat, clean and white and completely still. And 15 kilometers to the south, a volcano called Hekla stood silent under its own cloud, already building pressure in the dark below the earth. And no one, not a single person in that valley, had any reason to look up. Late autumn, 1103. The mountain had not moved in 2.5 centuries. Stöng farm, Þjórsárdalur Valley, 20 families, cattle breathing warm in the dark. Then Hekla opened. In hours, 55,000 square kilometers buried under volcanic ash. Families fled with nothing. Farms swallowed whole. The soil poisoned with fluorine. Livestock dying in fields. Children choking on gray air. One of Iceland's most fertile valleys wiped out so completely it was not excavated again for 800 years. 800 years. Because of a mountain nobody in that valley had ever heard make a sound. The farm at Stöng was not a modest place. Excavations carried out in 1939, when archaeologists first cleared 8 centuries of volcanic ash from the ruins, revealed a main hall 17 meters long and 6 meters wide, with walls combining cut turf blocks and heavy timber framing. Wood was rare in Iceland, scarce enough that the presence of substantial timber in the Stöng walls told excavators something important. Whoever lived here was wealthy, or at least well-connected enough to afford it. Driftwood, traded timber, reclaimed lumber from older structures. Every beam mattered. Every plank had a story before it arrived in this valley. The Þjórsárdalur, which translates loosely as the Valley of the Bull River, follows the course of the Þjórsa, Iceland's longest river, north from the lowlands into the edge of the central highlands. In the late 11th century, this valley held some of the island's most reliable farmland. The soil was deep, the river provided water and fish, the surrounding hills gave grazing for cattle and sheep through the summer months, and the farms were spread at reasonable distances from one another, close enough for cooperation during the hard work of haying season or slaughter time, distant enough for each household to manage its own land and its own affairs. The farm at Stöng was, according to the saga literature and the physical evidence left in the ash, one of the more prominent holdings in the valley. Gaukur Trandalson, a warrior farmer mentioned in the saga of Njál, one of the most widely read of the Icelandic sagas, is traditionally associated. Whether he was still living there in the final seasons before 1104 is uncertain, but the household that archaeology reconstructed from the preserved ruins was clearly a functioning, prosperous farm. Multiple structures: the main hall, a pantry room with sunken storage vats where dairy products pickled and whey, a separate smithy where bog iron work was being carried out, a cowshed, and later, discovered in subsequent excavations, the remains of a small church and a graveyard just outside the main complex. This was not a settlement on the margins. This was a place that had made itself permanent. Walking towards Stöng on a winter night in 1103, the first thing a traveler would have noticed was not the building. It was the absence of the building. The longhouse sat so low against the hillside, its turf walls so precisely the same color and texture as the surrounding ground, that the whole structure seemed to grow from the earth rather than sit on top of it. The roof was living grass, dense and winter pale, pressing down under its own weight against the birch bark waterproofing beneath. Drifted snow had filled in the angles between walls and slope. The structure had become part of the terrain. The only signals of habitation were a thin column of pale smoke rising from the roof vent, a dim orange glow leaking through the narrow entrance passage, and the low, warm sound, barely audible from outside, of animals shifting in the straw. The entrance was kept deliberately small. not from poverty of design, but from an understanding of physics that required no formal education to acquire. A wide door was an open wound. Cold air would pour through it, warm air would bleed out. The entrance passage at Stöng, a short corridor set perpendicular to the main hall before opening inward, functions as a buffer, a dead zone between the bitter air of the valley and the controlled atmosphere inside. Anyone entering had to bend, slow down, let the passage absorb the cold they brought with them. By the time they straightened up inside the hall, the thermal system had already sealed behind them. Inside, the longhouse was a single continuous world. The central hearth ran along the floor of the main hall, a long stone-lined channel that served as both fire pit and the social backbone of the household. Smoke rose to the ceiling, slow and steady, collecting in a warm layer beneath the roof beams. The soot that accumulated on those beams was not a problem the household ignored and endured. It was in fact doing something useful. It sealed the wood against moisture. It drove away the insects that would otherwise bore into the timber. It was a form of slow, continuous preservation, paid for in air quality, negotiated consciously. The roof vent could be opened or closed depending on conditions. In the depths of winter, it was kept nearly shut. The people inside breathed thicker air. They breathed warmer air. That was the deal. The sleeping areas ran along the raised platforms on either side of the main hall. Animal hides served as bedding. People slept close together, not because they had no choice, but because that proximity itself was a form of heating. A body generates heat continuously. A sleeping family in close quarters generates enough heat to matter, especially in a structure designed to lose as little warmth as possible through every surface. At the far end of the hall, separated by a partition, the cowshed held the household's cattle through the winter months. This was not unusual. Across Iceland and the wider Norse world, livestock and people shared the same roof from the first hard frosts until the spring thaw. The reasoning was entirely practical. A living cow produces roughly the same continuous heat output as several modern electric space heaters running simultaneously. Bring a herd indoors and the arithmetic becomes significant. The animal section was set slightly lower than the human living space, so that the warm air rising from the cattle drifted naturally upward and forward into the area where the household slept and worked. No pipes, no machinery, just biology guided by careful design. The walls of Stöng were built from turf, not as a compromise, not as a second-best solution, but as a deliberate material choice made by people who understood exactly what turf could do. Cut from the valley floor in thick rectangular blocks, the turf preserved the dense network of grass roots that held each block together. These roots, interlocked and tough, meant the wall was not simply stacked soil. It was a matrix of living material that over time continued to grow and tighten. New grass took hold across the outer face of the wall. Roots pushed deeper into the joints between blocks. The wall became more coherent year by year, not less. And inside that wall, inside the soil itself, were thousands of tiny pockets of trapped, motionless air. Still air is one of the most effective insulators in nature. Not moving air, which carries heat away rapidly, but air that sits without moving, sealed in pockets too small for convection to operate. Modern insulation materials, fiberglass bats, rigid foam panels, spray polyurethane, work on this same principle. They are, at their core, engineered arrangements of still air. The turf walls of Stöng worked the same way, without the engineering, without the chemistry, without the factory. The grass roots provided the structure, the soil provided the matrix, the trapped air provided the insulation. Walls at Stöng measured roughly 1 meter to 1.5 meters thick at the base. The outer face was exposed to whatever the valley threw at it: wind, rain, frost, driving sleet. The inner face, 2 arm lengths later, was warm. Whatever happened between those two surfaces happened slowly, and most of the cold simply gave up before it got through. The roof operated on the same logic, but with additional layers. Sheets of birch bark were laid first, creating a waterproof membrane. Then thick turf, stacked and compressed until the roof weighed several tons. That mass was not a burden. It was ballast against the winter wind, and thermal storage that slowed the release of interior heat through the overnight hours when the fire burned lower. As with the walls, grass grew back across the roof's surface over time, tightening and sealing it further. When snow fell and drifted against the walls, deep enough in hard winters to partially cover the structure entirely, the household did not shovel it away. They let it stay. Snow is full of trapped air. Its crystals form in ways that leave enormous amounts of void space between them. A thick snow cover against a turf wall adds another insulating layer, seals any remaining gaps against the wind, and further reduces heat loss. What looked from a distance like a farm slowly being buried was actually a farm in the process of being armored. The valley in winter looked dead. The farms had vanished under white, but beneath that white, the fires were burning, the cattle were breathing, the children were sleeping. The exact season of Hekla's 1104 eruption is not certain. The annals, specifically the Annales Regi and the Logman's Annal, the oldest Icelandic records of the event, mentioned a sandfall winter, a period when the finest volcanic particles were blown by wind across the landscape, creating conditions like a sandstorm in the months following the initial eruption. This detail suggests the volcano may have broken open sometime in autumn, most likely October, though the precise date has not survived in any source. What has survived is the description of the aftermath, and it is thorough. The night before that eruption, the Þjórsárdalur Valley would have been fully into the rhythms of the winter settling in. Cattle and sheep that had spent the summer on the highland pastures would have been brought down weeks earlier. The hay that had been cut and dried through late summer and stacked in the farm storage areas was being rationed carefully, because the person managing this farm, whoever held that responsibility in the household, understood that the hay had to last until the grass returned in spring. Every armful of fodder counted. The sunken storage vats in the pantry room held dairy products preserved in whey. Dried and salted fish and meat hung from beams or sat in sealed containers. The household was provisioned and sealed, and by all the measures available to the people living there, ready. The fire in the main hearth had been burning for weeks without interruption. In a well-maintained longhouse in winter, the fire was never fully extinguished. It was managed, banked, fed, and watched. Someone always had the responsibility of making sure it did not go out, because relighting it from cold was difficult, time-consuming, and expensive in terms of tinder and energy. The fire was not just warmth, it was light in a darkness that lasted from mid-afternoon until mid-morning. It was the center of every activity: cooking, tool repair, textile work, the telling of stories after the evening meal when the household had settled. There were children here. The archaeology and the saga literature both confirm that the farms in this valley were multi-generational household operations. Grandparents, parents, workers, perhaps a few thralls. The whole infrastructure of an 11th century Icelandic farm under one roof, breathing the same smoky air, sleeping in the same heat, completely surrounded by the same quiet. The mountain to the south had been silent for as long as anyone in the valley had been alive. It had been silent for longer than that. Hekla had not erupted since before the valley was first established. The earliest farms in the Þjórsárdalur were established around 950 CE. The mountain had been quiet for roughly a century and a half by then, and would remain quiet for another century and a half after that. No living person in the valley in 1103 had any memory of it being otherwise. No parent had warned their children about it. No farmer had built their holding with any thought of what a mountain 15 kilometers to the south might one day do. The turf walls kept the cold out. The fire kept the darkness back. The cattle kept the heat steady. Everything the household knew how to do, they were doing. Hekla is a stratovolcano, a ridge-shaped mountain formed by repeated eruptions along a fissure that runs roughly 5.5 kilometers in length. Unlike the cone-shaped volcanoes of popular imagination, Hekla is elongated, a raised spine of accumulated erupted material running northeast to southwest across the southern Icelandic landscape. Its tephras, the fragmented rock and ash ejected during explosive eruptions, are rich in fluorine, a chemical that is acutely toxic to grazing animals, and at high enough concentrations harmful to people. In 1104, Hekla had been building pressure for 2.5 centuries. The longer a volcano of this type remains dormant, the more pressure accumulates, and the more violent the eventual release tends to be. The 1104 eruption was by geological measure a magnitude 5 on the volcanic explosive index, a Plinian eruption, meaning it produced a sustained column of material driven high into the atmosphere, not simply a lava flow spreading across the ground.